Stay with me. Stay with me, please.
I'm here.
Lock the doors. Move! It's okay. You're okay. I've got you.
I'm cold.
No, keep looking at me.
Medic's on the way!
You're not leaving me. Do you hear me?
She wasn't supposed to be the one bleeding. That was the first thing Brian Coley thought when he felt her weight fall against him. Warm, trembling, and wrong. So completely wrong. Because this was supposed to be the day everything changed between them. The day he had finally stopped running from what he felt and done something about it. Their wedding day. Not a grand declaration of love. Brian Coley did not do grand declarations. It had been quiet, intentional. He had stood at the end of that aisle and watched Amy Louise walk toward him in white lace and a veil, and for the first time in his adult life, he had felt something he couldn't control and hadn't wanted to. And now she was bleeding through that same white lace, collapsed against his chest, with a blade wound where a wedding day had been. The ballroom had gone completely silent. 40 of the most feared men on the continent, men who had watched executions without blinking, stood completely still, because even they understood that something irreversible had just happened. The assassin's blade had been meant for Brian, positioned perfectly, timed perfectly, and at the last possible second, on his wedding day, in front of everyone, Amy had moved. She had stepped in front of him. Brian's arms closed around her before his mind caught up with his body. Her fingers gripped the lapel of his tuxedo. Her lips parted like she was trying to say something, and she almost smiled. She almost smiled at him, with a blade wound in her chest, in a wedding gown soaked red, surrounded by armed men. And Brian Coley, cold, untouchable, feared Brian Coley, felt something inside him crack straight down the middle. Why would she do this? Why would she risk everything, on this day of all days, for a man who had taken 3 years to finally choose her? And the more terrifying question, was he about to lose her the moment he'd finally let himself have her? If this story is already pulling you in, and you can feel your heart in your throat, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a single episode when new dark romance stories drop. Because this is only the beginning. But to understand why Amy Louise stepped in front of that blade, why a woman who had spent 3 years loving a man in silence chose the most permanent, irreversible way possible to say what she had never said out loud, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the morning Brian Coley walked into her life, handed her an impossible job, and accidentally gave her his heart without either of them knowing it. Chapter 1. Brian Coley had not planned on getting married this year, or last year, or if someone had asked him 3 years ago, any year within reasonable projection. And yet here he was, in a tuxedo, in a venue that Amy had organized down to the last flower arrangement, because of course she had, standing at the end of an aisle that felt approximately 17 miles long, watching the doors at the far end with an expression that Marcus Yoon would later describe as the single most human I have ever seen your face look, and I say that with complete respect and mild concern. Amy had organized their own wedding. He had offered, twice, to bring in an external coordinator. She had looked at him with the specific expression she made when she was about to be politely immovable and said, "Brian, I have been running your world for 3 years. I am not outsourcing our wedding to someone who doesn't know that you hate peonies and will absolutely notice if there are peonies." He did hate peonies. He had mentioned it once. She had remembered. That was the thing about Amy Louise. She remembered everything, not as a function of her job, but as a function of who she was. She paid attention to him in a way that had always made him feel simultaneously seen and terrified, and he had spent a significant portion of 3 years pretending that wasn't happening. He had stopped pretending approximately 6 weeks ago. He had walked into her office, sat down across from her desk, and said, with all the romantic eloquence of a man who had never done anything like this in his life, "I would like this to be different. Between us, I would like that." Amy had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had said, "I have been waiting for you to figure that out for 2 years and 4 months. I have a timestamp." He had asked her to marry him the following week. She had said yes before he finished the sentence. He was still rehearsing that particular conviction when the first gunshot shattered the chandelier above the east corridor, and everything he had spent years building came apart in exactly 90 seconds. The room exploded into controlled chaos. Bodyguards moving, weapons drawn, civilians scrambling. Brian was already in motion, hand going to the firearm at his side, eyes cutting through the chaos with the precision of a man who had trained for exactly this. His men were good. His perimeter was solid. Whoever had breached it was either exceptional or suicidal. It turned out they were both. The assassin came from the interior, not the exterior breach, which had been a decoy, beautifully executed. He came through the service corridor, through the kitchen. He had a uniform, a face that matched the staff manifest, and a blade designed to leave no ballistic trace. He had studied Brian. He knew Brian's position in the room. He knew the security rotation. He knew exactly which angle left the smallest window of exposure. What he had not accounted for, what no one had accounted for, was Amy.
She saw him before the bodyguards did.
Maybe it was the way he moved. Maybe it was 3 years of watching this world closely enough to know when something was wrong. Whatever it was, Amy Louise saw the blade come up, saw the trajectory, and she did not freeze. She moved. The blade caught her across the chest, deep and fast, and she went down against Brian so hard he staggered back 2 steps before his arms locked around her. For 3 full seconds, Brian Coley could not process what had happened. Then he looked down at her face, her eyes half open, her lips parting around something that was not quite a word, and every wall he had ever built began to crack at the base. Amy. His voice came out wrong. Too raw. Too much. Amy, look at me. Her hand was still gripping his lapel. She had not let go. She had not let go. Coming up in Chapter 2, Brian carries Amy out of that ballroom with his bare hands and no plan except that she is not going to die. But when the doctor delivers the news and Marcus starts asking questions Brian cannot answer, a terrifying possibility begins to surface. The assassin didn't find Brian by accident.
Someone very close gave them the map.
And whoever it was, they knew exactly who Amy was, and they sent the blade for her anyway. Chapter 2. The hospital had a policy about firearms. Brian ignored it. No one stopped him. People in Brian Coley's proximity developed a strong instinct for which battles were survivable, and tonight, with blood on his tuxedo and Amy Louise unconscious on a gurney in front of him, the man radiated something that made even the security guard near the entrance quietly step aside. Marcus was on the phone behind him, coordinating the lockdown of the ballroom, identifying the assassin, who had not survived the encounter with Brian's men, and doing the 17 other things that kept the organization from catching fire in a crisis.
He was good at that.
He was the best Brian had ever seen at managing catastrophe calmly. But even Marcus, mid-call, kept glancing at Brian. And what he saw on Brian's face made him speak quieter, as if raising his voice might break something. The surgical team took Amy through a set of doors that closed behind her, and Brian stopped walking. He stood in the corridor, completely still. His hands, which had held empires, signed contracts that moved millions and ended the lives of men who deserved it, hung at his sides and did absolutely nothing useful. This was the part Brian had no training for. Dr. Song Hannah found him there 40 minutes later. She was the only physician in the city whose discretion Brian trusted, which was the reason he had called her the moment the ambulance doors closed. She had a kind of face that gave nothing away prematurely, which Brian usually respected. Tonight, it made him want to put his fist through the wall. "She's stable," Dr. Song said, before he could speak. The blade missed the primary vessels by less than a centimeter. She lost significant blood, but she is stable. Brian heard the words, processed them, said nothing. Dr. Song studied him for a moment with the careful expression of someone who has delivered a great deal of news to powerful people and knows the difference between relief and something more complicated. "She's going to need rest," she continued. "No stress.
No excitement.
And when she wakes up, she's going to be in considerable pain. So whoever talks to her first needs to be. I'll be there when she wakes up." Dr. Song looked at him. "I was going to say calm. Whoever talks to her first needs to be calm."
A pause.
I'll be there, Brian repeated. Dr. Song made a small, professional sound that conveyed a great deal without saying any of it, and led him to the room. Amy looked smaller in the hospital bed. That was the first thing Brian noticed, and it unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. Amy Louise was not a small woman. Not in presence, not in personality, not in the space she quietly occupied in every room she walked into. But lying there with monitors attached and her braids spread against the pillow, she looked like someone had turned the volume all the way down on a sound he hadn't realized he depended on. He sat in the chair beside her bed. He did not touch her hand, because that would be something. He just sat there, in a blood-stained tuxedo, in a hospital room, in the dark, and tried to remember the last time he had been this afraid. He came up empty. Marcus appeared in the doorway at some point. Quiet, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, which was his version of a crisis uniform. Assassin's been identified, he said, keeping his voice low. Felix Doe. Freelance. High-end. He doesn't take contracts from civilians, only organizations. Brian didn't look away from Amy. Who hired him? Silence. Marcus. We're not sure yet, but Brian. Marcus stepped into the room, closed the door. The access he had. The staff manifest, the security rotation, the blueprint of the room. That's not something you buy off a street contact. Someone inside gave him that. The air changed. Brian turned his head slowly and looked at his second-in-command. Someone in our inner circle, Marcus said carefully, either hired him or sold the information to whoever did. And whoever it was, he hesitated. The blade was aimed at you. But Amy was documented in that manifest as your personal attaché. Her position in the room was included in the briefing. Brian said nothing. They knew she'd be close to you, Marcus continued. They may have anticipated she could interfere. Or, he stopped. Or, Brian's voice was very quiet now. Or she was the secondary target. And we just don't know why yet. The monitor beeped steadily. Amy's chest rose and fell. Brian looked at her face. Peaceful in a way she never was when she was awake, because awake, Amy Louise was always doing 3 things at once and thinking about 7 more. Someone had put her name on a briefing document. Someone had calculated the space between her and a blade. Brian stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Marcus with an expression that made his second-in-command, who had seen Brian at his worst for 12 years, take one quiet step backward.
Find out who, Brian said.
Every name, every contact, every financial trail. I don't care how deep it goes or whose face I find at the bottom of it. Marcus nodded. And Marcus. Brian turned back to Amy. Double the perimeter on this room. No one enters without my approval. Not staff. Not family. Not anyone. Understood. She wakes up, Brian said, so quietly it was almost to himself, and the first face she sees is mine. Marcus left without another word. Brian sat back down, folded his hands, and waited. What happens in Chapter 3 is going to rearrange everything you think you know about Brian Coley. Because when Amy's eyes open and the first thing she does, with a chest wound, barely conscious, in a hospital bed, is look straight at him and say, "You didn't eat again, did you?" Something in the most feared Mafia king in the city quietly comes undone. But the warmth doesn't last long, because Marcus's investigation is already turning up a name, and it belongs to someone sitting at Brian's own table. Chapter 3. Amy opened her eyes at 4:47 in the morning. She knew this because there was a clock on the wall directly across from her bed, and reading the clock was easier than processing everything else in the room. The 4 in her arm, the monitor beeping beside her head, the dull, enormous ache spreading across her chest like someone had parked a car on her sternum, and the fact that Brian Coley was sitting 3 feet away from her in a hospital chair looking like he hadn't moved in hours. He was still in the tuxedo. It was still bloodstained. His tie was loosened exactly 1 centimeter, which for Brian was the equivalent of falling completely apart. He was asleep, barely. His head had dropped forward slightly, one hand resting on his knee, and even unconscious, the man managed to look like he was guarding something. Amy watched him for a moment. Then she looked at the ceiling. Then she looked at the clock. Then she looked back at him. She remembered the blade. She remembered the angle of it, the speed. She remembered making the choice, and it had been a choice, clear and conscious, not impulse, not accident. She had seen it coming and she had moved because the alternative was something her entire body rejected before her brain could finish the thought. She was not sorry. She was in extraordinary pain, but she was not sorry. You didn't eat again, did you? Her voice came out rough and not entirely loud, but it was enough. Brian's head came up instantly. Not the slow surfacing of someone waking from deep sleep, but the sharp alertness of someone who had never been fully under. His eyes found her immediately. For 3 full seconds, he just looked at her. Amy had spent 3 years cataloging Brian Coley's expressions, or rather, the very small variations between them, because Brian's face operated on a spectrum between controlled and slightly less controlled. She knew his business face, his threat face, his patience running out face, the one he made when Marcus said something that landed, and he didn't want to admit it. She did not have a name for the face he was making right now. "You're awake," he said. "That does appear to be what's happening, yes." She tried to shift against the pillow and immediately regretted it.
Ow.
"Don't move." "I wasn't planning a marathon, Brian. I was just... Don't move." He was already on his feet, hand going to the call button near the bed, pressing it with the controlled urgency of a man who had decided that medical professionals were going to appear in this room in the next 30 seconds, whether they wanted to or not. Amy watched him.
Ivy Phoenix.
"You have a 6-centimeter blade wound in your chest. It's not that deep." He turned and looked at her with an expression that short-circuited her next sentence entirely. "Okay," she said. "It's a little deep." The nurses arrived. Dr. Song arrived shortly after, calm, professional, and visibly unsurprised to find Brian Coley standing at the foot of the bed with the energy of a man prepared to personally supervise every step of Amy's recovery. Vitals were checked. Medication was adjusted. Questions were asked. Amy answered all of them with more clarity than someone at 4:47 a.m. recovering from blood loss had any business having, and Brian stood there through all of it, silent and too still, watching her face. When the medical staff finally filed out, the room went quiet again. Amy looked at him. He looked at her. "You should go home," she said. "Or go back to the penthouse or wherever. You have things to handle. You always have things to handle."
I'm stay.
Brian. Amy. Just her name. Nothing else attached to it. But the way he said it, like it had weight, like it meant something beyond the 2 syllables, made her go quiet. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then, "Is everyone okay? From the gathering?" "Yes." "The catering manager, Mr. O, the one I was talking to, he has bad knees. I was worried about whether he was able to."
Amy.
"I'm just asking."
He's fine.
"Everyone is fine."
A pause.
"Except you." "I'm fine too." Brian pulled his chair closer to the bed. He sat down, leaned forward, and rested his arms on his knees. And this was close, closer than Brian Coley voluntarily got to people, and Amy felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the wound.
"Why did you do it?" he said.
Not accusation. Not exactly a question. Something in between, like a door opening on a room he hadn't decided to enter yet. Amy kept her eyes on the ceiling. "You were in the trajectory. My men would have." There wasn't time. "Amy." "Brian, I made a decision in a fraction of a second, and we can debate the logistics forever, but I am very tired and my chest genuinely feels like it lost an argument with a truck. So maybe." "Why?" he said again. Quieter this time. She looked at him. And for just a moment, a sliver of a moment, the space between one heartbeat and the next, everything she had spent 3 years not saying sat right there on the surface, where he could see it if he looked. He looked. She glanced away first. "Get some sleep, Brian.
Please."
You look terrible." He didn't say anything for a long time, but he didn't leave either. He settled back into the chair, and when Amy's eyes eventually closed again, he was still there, watching the door, watching her face, watching something inside himself that had just changed shape permanently and was not going back. His phone buzzed once. He looked at the screen. "Marcus, we have a name." Brian stared at the message for a long time. Then he looked at Amy, sleeping, pale, chest rising steadily, and something cold and absolute settled over him. Whoever did this, he thought, has no idea what they'd just started. Chapter 4 is going to shake this story to its roots. Because the name Marcus found, Brian knows it. He trusted it. He built something with it. And when he sits across the table from the person responsible and realizes just how far back the betrayal goes, and what it has to do with Amy specifically, the cold Mafia king everyone fears is going to become something much, much more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose. Chapter 4. The name was Raymond Lim. Brian had known Raymond for 11 years. They had built the eastern corridor of the organization together. Two young men with sharp minds and sharper ambitions, carving a path through a world that didn't forgive weakness. Raymond was not his closest ally, but he was trusted. He sat at the table. He knew the protocols, the rotations, the names, the faces. He had known Amy for almost as long as Brian had. Brian took the information Marcus laid out, financial transfers, communication logs, a contact chain that led cleanly from Raymond to Felix Doe's agency, and looked at it without expression for a full minute. Then he straightened the papers into a neat stack, set them aside, and stood. "Where is he?" Brian asked. "Still in the city," Marcus said. "His phones are active. He doesn't know we've traced it yet. Keep it that way. Don't move on him yet." Marcus frowned slightly. "Brian, I said don't move on him yet." He picked up his jacket. "Have him brought to the East Pier facility tonight. Quietly. I want 4 men minimum. And Marcus. I want him to arrive intact. I need to ask him something first." Marcus studied him. "You want to know why Amy was on the manifest?" "I want to know why he thought she needed to be." That was the thing that had been sitting behind Brian's eyes since 3 in the morning. He could map the motive for targeting him. Power plays, territorial disputes, the currency of fear that drove every move in his world. That made sense. That he could follow. But Amy's name on that document wasn't logistical. A good operative would strip unnecessary variables from a mission brief. Amy being flagged as personal attaché suggested that whoever built the brief wanted the operative to account for her, either as a potential interference or as something else entirely. Something Brian hadn't let himself finish thinking about until now. He drove to the hospital first. He would not skip that. Amy was awake when he arrived, propped against 2 pillows, eating what appeared to be hospital-issue crackers with a deep philosophical resignation of someone who has accepted their circumstances but has opinions about them. "These," she said, holding one up as he walked in, "are aggressively flavorless. I want you to know that."
"Good morning," Brian said.
"I have been lying here since 4:47 imagining jollof rice, and this is what I have." She set the cracker down. "There is no justice in this world." He sat down, looked at her face, color better, eyes clearer, posture more Amy than last night, which his chest responded to in a way he chose not to examine in detail. "How is the pain?" he asked. "Managed. Dr. Song is excellent. Tell me she gets a raise." "She's not on my payroll." "Then write her a letter of appreciation. A very detailed letter."
Amy. "I fine, Brian."
"I genuinely am. I want real food and I want to go home, and I want to know what's happening because you have your organization face on and that means something is moving." She looked at him steadily. What did Marcus find? He had not planned to tell her. That had been the plan. Keep it contained, protect the perimeter, handle it, and present Amy with a resolved situation rather than an active one. He was very good at that strategy with everyone in his life. He looked at her face, the cracker in her hand, the way her eyes held his without wavering, the way they always had, the way that had always quietly undone every wall he tried to build in her direction.
"Raymond Lim," he said.
Amy went very still. He provided the access, the manifest, the rotation, the venue blueprint. He built the brief for the operative. Brian paused. "Your name was in the brief, Amy. Flagged specifically." She put the cracker down. "Why?" Her voice was careful now. "No more jokes about jollof rice." "That's what I intend to find out tonight." Amy looked at the wall. Something moved behind her eyes, calculation, maybe, or something older. Recognition. Raymond never liked the fact that you listened to me, she said quietly. He brought it up once, maybe 8 months ago. Said it looked. She paused, choosing the word.
Soft.
He said it looked soft, having a woman that close to your operational space who wasn't a subordinate. Brian was very still. I didn't tell you at the time, because it seemed like his problem. I didn't think he would, she stopped.
Took a breath.
The monitor beside her beeped steadily. I didn't think he'd do something like this. You should have told me. You're right. She met his eyes. I should have. The silence between them was not empty. It had texture.
Wait.
Brian stood. I'll be back tonight. Brian. She reached out and caught his wrist, a small contact, her fingers light, but it stopped him completely. Don't do anything that can't be undone before you get the full picture. He looked down at her hand on his wrist, then at her face. Get some rest, he said. She let go. He walked out of that room carrying the weight of 11 years of misplaced trust in one hand, and something he still didn't have a name for, something that had been growing in Amy's direction for longer than he could honestly account for, in the other. By 9 that evening, Raymond Lim was at the East Pier facility. Brian sat across from him in a metal chair, jacket folded neatly over his knee, and said nothing for almost 2 minutes. Just looked at him. Raymond was trying to hold his composure and failing in the small, specific ways that Brian had been trained to read since he was 19, the jaw, the hands, the way the eyes moved. You wanted me dead, Brian said. That I understand. That's business. What I want you to explain to me, he leaned forward slightly, is why her name was in that brief. Raymond held out for 37 seconds. Then, because you would have been distracted. Protecting her would have slowed your response time. She was a liability, not a target. She almost died, Raymond. That was. She almost died, Brian repeated. And his voice, somehow, was very quiet now. More quiet than fury. More quiet than threat. The kind of quiet that meant every decision that followed had already been made. Raymond stopped talking. She almost died, Brian said one final time, almost to himself. And you put her name in that document knowing she would be close to me. Knowing what that meant. He stood. Smoothed his jacket. Looked at Raymond Lim, a man he had trusted for 11 years, who had calculated Amy Louise as collateral and signed off on it. Marcus, he said without raising his voice. Marcus appeared in the doorway. Finish this, Brian said. Then find me everyone else in the chain. He paused in the doorway without turning back. Every last one of them. Chapter 5 changes the game entirely. Because while Brian is dismantling the conspiracy from the inside out, Amy is in that hospital room doing the very thing Brian should have predicted she'd do, getting out of bed before she's cleared, showing up somewhere she wasn't supposed to be, and discovering something that neither of them saw coming. Something that will force Brian to make a choice that has nothing to do with the Empire and everything to do with her. Chapter 5. If there was one thing Dr. Song Hannah had learned in 15 years of medicine, it was that there were two kinds of patients. Those who followed instructions, and those who nodded very pleasantly while making entirely different plans. Amy Louise, she had concluded by day 2, was definitively the second kind. She had been pleasant about it. She had said, "Of course, doctor. And that makes complete sense. And I absolutely understand why rest is important." And Dr. Song had felt cautiously optimistic, right up until 9 a.m. on day 3 when she walked into Amy's room and found the bed empty, the floor neatly detached, and a sticky note on the pillow that read, "Gone for short walk. I left the monitor running, so you wouldn't worry. You're wonderful." Dr. Song looked at the note for a moment. Then she called Marcus. Marcus called Brian. Brian was in his car in 11 minutes, which was possibly a personal record, and the expression he wore when he walked through the hospital's side corridor was the kind that made the orderlies press themselves against the wall. He found Amy in the hospital chapel, not praying, sitting in the last pew, in a hospital gown with a cardigan over it that she had clearly acquired from somewhere, leaning forward with her elbows on the pew in front of her and her face in her hands. Not crying, thinking. The specific posture of someone who has followed a thought somewhere they didn't entirely expect it to lead. Brian stopped in the doorway. She heard him. She always heard him. He didn't know why he still found that surprising, and lifted her head. "Before you say anything," she said, "I was going absolutely insane in that room." You pulled out your four. Very carefully. "Amy." "Brian, I have been lying in that bed for 2 days with nothing to do but think, and I needed to move, and this is the furthest I've gone, I promise. I'm not being reckless." She shifted slightly and winced, which immediately undermined her argument. "Mostly." He walked down the aisle of the chapel and sat in the pew beside her. Not behind. Beside. And he didn't say anything for a moment, which, for Brian, was its own kind of statement. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked at the small altar at the front of the chapel. Stained glass caught the morning light, soft reds and golds that had no business being this pretty inside a hospital. "I've been thinking about why I did it," she said.
The blade.
"Because you asked me, and I gave you the quick answer, the logistics answer. And that was true. But it wasn't the whole answer, and we both know it." Brian said nothing, waiting. "I've been thinking about what it says about me," she continued. "That I've been standing in your world for 3 years, managing every piece of it, and somewhere along the way I stopped thinking of it as a job." She paused. "Stopped thinking of you as a job." The chapel was quiet. Somewhere in the hospital hallway, soft sounds, wheels, voices, a door. Far away. "Amy," Brian said. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. "I know what your world is. I know what you are. I know how you were built and what you've decided about things like this. I'm not making a case. I just needed to say it out loud somewhere because it's been sitting in my chest and—" She pressed her hand briefly to her sternum and winced at herself. Poor choice of metaphor. "Anyway." Brian turned to look at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the stained glass with the precise determination of someone who had said a brave thing and was now staring in any direction that wasn't his face. "Amy," he said again, "you don't have to say anything. Truly. Would you stop talking for 30 seconds?
She stopped.
Brian looked at her profile, the line of her jaw, the earring she still had in from the night of the gathering, one small diamond catching the chapel light. He had looked at this woman 100 times across rooms and chosen not to. He was looking now, and he was not choosing away. "When you went down," he said, slowly, "when I felt your weight against me, and I looked at your face."
He stopped.
Started again. "I've been in dangerous situations since I was 19 years old. I've walked out of rooms I had no business walking out of. I've made decisions that cost people their lives, and I've made my peace with every one of them because that's what this world requires." He paused. "I have never, not once, felt the way I felt in that moment." Amy had turned to look at him now. "I am not built for this," he said. "Whatever this is. I don't have a framework for it. I don't know what I'm doing." A pause so long it had its own pulse. Then, very quietly, "Neither do I," she said. "But I stepped in front of a blade, so apparently I'm not very rational about it anyway." Something in Brian's face shifted. Not a smile, not quite, but the closest thing he had gotten in longer than he could account for. Amy caught it and felt it land in her chest like something coming home. "I need you to go back to your room," he said. "I know. And I need you to stay there until Dr. Song clears you." "I will. And when you're out," he said, "we're going to have a very different conversation than this one." Amy looked at him. "A better one?" Brian stood, held out his hand.
"Considerably," he said.
She took his hand. He helped her to her feet, careful, measured, hyper-aware of the wound, and kept hold of it for 3 steps longer than was strictly necessary before his grip shifted to her elbow, which was appropriate, which was correct. They walked back to the room. He didn't let go of her elbow the entire way. She noticed. She didn't say anything. She just walked beside him, quietly, through the hospital corridor at mid-morning, and decided that this, all of this, had been worth every single second of it. Chapter 6 is where the Empire strikes back, because Brian's internal cleanup has shaken loose a second layer, one that goes higher than Raymond Lim and older than anyone expected. And it sends something directly to Amy's hospital room that Brian does not intercept in time. Chapter 6. Brian had not become what he was by being careless. He had doubled Amy's security. He had vetted every staff member assigned to her floor personally. He had implemented a check-in protocol that Marcus ran every 3 hours, and he had done all of this because he was not going to be caught a second time. He was almost not caught a second time. The envelope arrived with the morning mail cart, mundane, white, addressed in Amy's name to her hospital room, with a return address that checked out against the hospital's mail vendor registry. It had been physically processed through the postal facility 2 days ago, which meant whoever sent it had planned this before Raymond Lim had been extracted from the picture. Amy's day shift nurse, following protocol, set it on the nightstand without opening it. Amy, following her own personal protocol of being curious about everything, opened it herself. Brian walked in 32 minutes later and found her sitting very still in the center of her bed holding a single photograph. He was at her side in 4 steps. The photograph showed Amy. Taken from a distance, telephoto lens, she was on a street he recognized as 3 blocks from Brian's penthouse. She was carrying coffee, takeout bags. She was laughing at her phone. The timestamp in the corner was from 8 weeks ago. There was a single handwritten line on the back of the photograph. "We know what she means to him. Do you?" Brian took the photograph from her hands. His face had gone very still, the absolute stillness that his men had learned to fear more than any raised voice. Amy looked at him. 8 weeks ago, she said. That's before the gathering. Before Raymond. I know. This goes deeper than Raymond. I know, Amy. She leaned back against her pillow, processing. Her hands were steady, which Brian noted and filed away as yet another thing about this woman that floored him quietly. She had been in a hospital bed for 4 days. She had just received a threat photograph, and she was steady. They knew before Raymond acted, she said. Which means Raymond wasn't the origin. He was the instrument. Someone gave him the idea. Someone who'd been watching us, watching me, for at least 2 months. Yes. That's a significant operation. Yes. Brian. She looked at him directly. Who hates you enough to build something this patient? He sat down on the edge of her bed, looked at the photograph in his hands. The image of Amy laughing at her phone on a Tuesday morning, completely unaware that someone 100 meters away was logging her as leverage. Leverage, he thought. That was what it was. She had been identified as leverage, which meant someone had looked at Brian Coley, cold, sealed, untouchable Brian Coley, and correctly identified that Amy Louise was the one point where the walls were thin. He looked at her. She looked back.
There's a man, he said.
His name is Victor Singh. We had a dispute over the Western Trade Corridor approximately 4 years ago. It was resolved. Resolved how? In the way things are resolved in my world. Amy nodded slowly, but apparently not completely. Apparently not. And he saw Amy Louise walking down a Tuesday morning street carrying coffee and thought, leverage. He saw you and understood something I hadn't said out loud yet, Brian said. And the bluntness of it, unadorned, unqualified, landed in the room like something irrevocable. Amy went very quiet. Brian stood, straightened, put the photograph in his jacket pocket. I'll handle Victor Singh. Brian. I will handle it, Amy. He turned at the door. I am going to need you to trust me. She looked at him. I stepped in front of a blade for you. He paused. I think, she said gently, that ship has sailed. He almost smiled again. It was becoming a pattern. Get some rest, he said. And this time, when he said it, it didn't feel like dismissal. It felt like something closer to I'll be back, which she understood because she had spent 3 years learning the difference. She watched the door close behind him and then looked at the ceiling and had a very quiet, very thorough conversation with herself about what exactly was happening and whether she was handling it with appropriate dignity. She concluded that she was not. She was grinning at a hospital ceiling alone at 11 in the morning. She decided she didn't care, even slightly. Chapter 7. Brian goes to find Victor Singh, and what he finds there changes everything. Because Victor isn't running. Victor is expecting him. And what Victor says in that meeting is going to force Brian to make the hardest decision of his entire career, One that might cost him everything he's built, but if he doesn't make it, costs him something he's only just admitted he cannot live without. Chapter 7. Victor Sang was waiting for him. That was the first wrong note. The absence of scramble, of running, of the scramble defense energy Brian had expected when he walked into Victor's operation with 12 of his best men and neutralized the perimeter in 11 minutes flat. The building was not abandoned. The guards were present. And Victor Sang was sitting in his office on the 4th floor with 2 cups of tea on the table, looking for all the world like a man who had been expecting company. Brian dismissed his men to the corridor and sat across from Victor. Victor Sang was 63. Compact, silver-haired, with a kind of face that had been pleasant once and had simply sharpened over decades into something more precise. He pushed the 2nd cup of tea toward Brian. Brian didn't touch it. "You've been thorough," Victor said. "Raymond Lim, the financial chain, the mail system." He nodded slowly, appreciative. "You've always been thorough. It's what I respected about you, even when we were opposed." "You sent someone to kill me," Brian said. "I sent someone to negotiate," Victor said. "The method was aggressive. I accept that. A man with a blade is not negotiation. In my experience," Victor said, "sometimes it's the only language that gets attention." He leaned forward. "But your woman, that was not my intention. I want you to know that. She was in the brief to be accounted for, not targeted. What happened was Felix exceeding his parameters, and he paused. Genuinely displeased. Brian looked at him. "What did you want?" Victor folded his hands on the table. "The Western Corridor dispute from 4 years ago was not resolved, Brian. It was paused. You know this. The agreement we reached had conditions that your expansion this past year has violated 3 times. I raised it through proper channels twice. You didn't respond." Brian was silent. "I am not a reckless man," Victor continued. "I am a patient man with a legitimate grievance and a deadline that has run out. I needed your attention. I needed you at a table." He spread his hands. "Here we are." The room was quiet. Brian looked at this man, not young, not emotional, not vengeful in the theatrical sense, but calculating in the way that was actually dangerous, and ran the logic chain he had been building for 4 days. Raymond Lim, an instrument, motivated by ego, by the belief that Amy was a weakness to exploit, recruited by Victor for access, and the specific desire to see Brian diminished. Victor Sang, the origin, patient,
Strategic.
not murderous by preference, but willing to allow for the possibility. Amy, at the center of it, not because she was weak, because she had been correctly identified as the one thing Brian Coley would not walk away from, which meant Victor had understood something true. "You want to renegotiate the corridor agreement," Brian said. "I want a fair agreement, one that accounts for the growth of both operations. And you chose to pursue that by putting Brian stopped. Replace the word, he almost said, with a functional one. By putting a member of my household in the path of a blade." Victor held his gaze. "I chose to pursue it by getting your full attention. I have it." A long silence. Brian picked up the cup of tea, drank it, set it down. "You have my full attention," he said. "Talk." They were there for 4 hours. What was agreed would take 3 weeks to formalize and would require Brian to give up 2 transit points he had built over 8 years. It was not a small concession. His father's version of him, the version shaped by loss and fury and the doctrine that any ground surrendered was ground lost forever, would have walked out of that room with blood on his hands and nothing signed. Brian Coley signed. He signed because the alternative was a war that would drag on for months, destabilize half his operation, and require the kind of sustained attention that he had discovered. In the past 4 days, he was no longer willing to give exclusively to the Empire. He was walking to his car when Marcus fell into step beside him.
"Well," Marcus said.
"Settled," Brian said. Marcus stared at him. "You settled it? Is that surprising?" "Honestly, a little bit, yes." Marcus paused. "Amy is going to take full credit for this somehow. I just want you to know that. She's going to say she fixed it from her hospital bed." Brian got into the car. "She's not entirely wrong," he said. Marcus blinked, looked at the car door. then looked at the sky briefly, as if recalibrating his understanding of the world. He got in the passenger seat. They drove back to the hospital. Chapter 8 is where it all comes home. Amy is cleared. Brian picks her up. And in the car on the way back to the penthouse, something is said by both of them, haltingly and imperfectly and completely, that changes the shape of everything going forward. Also, Amy eats actual jollof rice, and the entire organization breathes a collective sigh of relief. Chapter 8. Dr. Song Hannah cleared Amy on a Thursday morning with the specific energy of someone who is relieved and impressed and never wanted to repeat the experience. "You are healing faster than projected," she said, reviewing the scans with the methodical satisfaction of someone who is excellent at their job. "The wound is closing cleanly. Pain levels are manageable. You can return to normal activity, and I do mean normal, not your personal definition of normal, which I now understand involves treating rest as a negotiating position." "I hear you completely," Amy said. "Do you?"
Ido.
Dr. Song gave her the look of a woman who had dealt with Amy Louise for 5 days and had learned things about her character. Light activity.
No lifting.
Follow up in 2 weeks. And eat properly. She closed the chart. "I've communicated the care instructions to Mr. Coley's household." Amy paused. "You've communicated to his household?" "He requested it. In writing. With a very specific list of questions." Dr. Song had the expression of someone filing this information without comment. "He's waiting outside." Amy looked at the door. Then she looked at the window. Then the ceiling. Then at her own hands for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She had changed into real clothes. Marcus had sent a bag, bless him, containing things Amy had actually chosen herself, which meant Marcus had either gone into her room or called and asked, and either way she was promoting him internally in her estimation. Dark jeans, soft knit top, her own earrings. Human again. Brian was in the corridor. Not pacing, Brian didn't pace, but standing with a quality of contained waiting that she recognized from years of watching him hold himself together by sheer discipline. He looked at her when she came out. A full, unguarded look, the kind she was starting to recognize as his new mode in her presence. "Ready," he said. "More than," she said. The drive was quiet for the first 6 minutes. Not uncomfortable, they had always been able to be quiet together, which was rarer than people understood. But there was something building in the air of the car, some unfinished conversation that had started in a hospital chapel and hadn't yet landed anywhere permanent. "The situation with Victor Sang is resolved," Brian said. "Marcus told me. You and Marcus have been communicating. I may have texted him approximately 40 times in the past 5 days." "I know." He showed me the texts. He absolutely did not. The one where you asked him to describe my face when I found out you'd left your room. Amy covered her mouth. He swore he wouldn't. He lied. For just a moment, the corner of Brian's mouth moved. He said my face was, he checked the exact word, profoundly unhinged. Amy laughed. Actually laughed free and full, and then winced because her chest still had opinions about that. "Don't laugh," Brian said immediately. I know. Amy. "I'm fine, it just..." She pressed her hand to her side. "Marcus is a traitor, and I love him." Brian watched the road. She watched his profile. The city moved past the windows. Late morning, ordinary world, pedestrians and storefronts, and a sky that was doing something almost warm for the time of year. "Brian," she said. "Yes." In the chapel. "You said we'd have a different conversation when I was out." A pause.
"I did," he said. "We're in a car," she said.
"I'm out." She looked at her hands. "I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I know what you are. I know your world, and what it costs and what it asks. I have no expectations beyond." She paused, choosing carefully, "beyond knowing where we actually are. Because I'd rather have the honest version than the comfortable distance." Brian was quiet for long enough that she began constructing an exit from the conversation in her head, graceful, dignified, no damage done. "3 years ago," he said, "when you first came to work for me, I told Marcus within the first 2 weeks that you were going to be a problem." She blinked. A problem. Not operationally. I meant, he paused, which for Brian was significant. I meant that you were the kind of person it was going to be very difficult to keep in a category. Amy said nothing. I've been keeping you in a category for 3 years, he said. And I was aware on some level for a large portion of that time that the category was incorrect. I just had excellent reasons not to address it. What changed? She asked softly. You stepped in front of a blade, he said. And I held you in my arms while you bled in a white dress, and I looked at your face, and everything I had decided about what I was and wasn't capable of became, very briefly, completely irrelevant. The car stopped at a light. Brian turned and looked at her. I don't know what I'm doing, he said. I told you that. I meant it. I am not practiced at this. I will get things wrong. I am almost certainly going to get things wrong in ways that are specific and frustrating and will require patience that I do not naturally inspire. Amy looked at him. Brian. I'm saying that I know my limitations. Brian. She put her hand over his on the gear shift. He went very still. I organized your life for 3 years. I know all your limitations. I have a spreadsheet. He looked at her hand on his. Are you telling me, he said slowly, that you have a spreadsheet of my limitations? It's very comprehensive. A pause. I have a column, she continued, called Will Not Apologize But Will Buy Food Instead. That is 47 entries. Brian looked at her face, and this time, the corner of his mouth did not almost move. It moved fully, actually moved. An actual, real, unguarded smile on the face of Brian Coley, which Amy was fairly certain she was the only person on earth who had seen, and which she intended to carry around like a prize for the rest of her life. 47, he repeated. I can show you the spreadsheet. He turned back to the road as the light changed. His hand, under hers, turned over and held it. He didn't let go for the rest of the drive. She didn't either. 1 chapter left. Chapter 9 brings the final confrontation, not with an enemy this time, but with the people closest to Brian who need to understand what has shifted and what it means going forward. And then something happens in the penthouse that nobody planned, that Marcus will tell the story about for the next decade, that involves a bowl of jollof rice and the most un-Brian thing Brian Coley has ever done in his life. Chapter 9. Marcus Yoon held the meeting. This was itself a statement. Brian didn't hold meetings about personal matters, and so sending Marcus to brief the senior table was Brian's way of handling the conversation without having the conversation directly, which was, per Amy's spreadsheet, column 3, avoidance methods that technically count as communication, within normal parameters. Marcus stood in front of the 12 men at the senior table, the lieutenants, the regional managers, the men who ran the day-to-day of the Coley organization, and said, with the calm professionalism of a man who has thought carefully about how to phrase this. Amy Lewis's role within the organization is changing. Effective immediately, she operates under direct personal authority of Brian Coley, not as household manager, not as attaché, but as a principal. Any man in this room who has a problem with that can bring it to me, privately, once. He paused. I will not be bringing it to Brian. Those conversations end here. Silence. One of the regional managers, a man named Daniel Wu, who had been with the organization for 8 years and had survived by being smart, raised his hand. Is this, he asked carefully, because she took the blade? It is because Brian Coley made a decision, Marcus said. The blade was the occasion. The decision was overdue. A longer silence. Then Daniel Wu nodded slowly, with the expression of a man recalibrating several things simultaneously. Fair enough. The rest of the table either nodded or said nothing, which in this world meant the same thing. Marcus ended the meeting in 9 minutes. He had been expecting 12. He considered this a personal best. At the penthouse, Amy was in the kitchen. This was her choice. She had looked at the space she had managed for 3 years, at the kitchen she had stocked and organized and occasionally cooked in when she needed to think, and she had decided that what she wanted, more than anything, was to make jollof rice. She was cleared for light activity. Stirring counted as light activity. She was choosing to believe that firmly. She was halfway through the tomato base when Brian appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the stove. At her. At the stove again. Dr. Song said rest, he said. Dr. Song said light activity. Cooking is therapeutic.
She didn't look up from the pot.
Also, I haven't had real food in 5 days and I will lose my mind. You're welcome to stand there and supervise if it makes you feel better. Brian stood in the kitchen doorway for approximately 4 more seconds. Then he walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and started pulling out the additional ingredients she hadn't gotten to yet. Amy stared. Brian set a collection of items on the counter with the methodical efficiency of a man who had identified a task and applied himself to it. Do you? Amy said slowly. Know how to cook? No, Brian said. Tell me what to do. She looked at him. Brian Coley, Mafia king, man who signed international trade agreements and had people removed from rooms with a glance. Standing in his own kitchen in his dress shirt with his sleeves rolled up, waiting to be told what to cut. The plantains, she said after a moment. He looked at the plantains.
How?
Like this. She leaned over, angled her hand to show him. Their shoulders were close. He watched her hand, then replicated the motion with a precision that was completely Brian. Whatever he decided to do, he did correctly. They cooked together for 40 minutes. Amy directed and he executed, and he never complained about the direction and only asked clarifying questions, which was, per the spreadsheet, column 11, moments of unexpected cooperation, an extremely rare occurrence. When it was done, and they were sitting at the kitchen island with actual bowls of actual jollof rice, Brian looked at the food for a moment. Then he picked up his fork. He ate a mouthful. He did not say anything for 3 seconds.
This is good, he said.
I know, Amy said. You should have been making this for 3 years. I have been making this for 3 years. You kept calling it the rice. He looked at her. I knew it was jollof. You called it the rice. You were being avoidant, which is column 3 of the spreadsheet. She pointed her fork at him. I have documentation. Brian looked at her, then at his bowl, then at the kitchen around them, his kitchen, his space, which felt different now. Less like a room in a building and more like something specific, something that had an Amy-shaped element it had always been missing. Burn the spreadsheet, he said. I have a backup.
Amy.
Cloud-based. Multiple servers. I will have Marcus. Marcus helped me build it. She was smiling now, fully, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed. He's in column 17. People who understand Brian better than Brian does. Brian set his fork down, looked at her face. The kitchen light caught the small diamond in her earring, the same one, still in from the night everything changed. Amy Louise, he said, in the voice he used when something was decided and permanent. I need you to know something. She stopped smiling. Not from worry, but because she knew his serious register and knew to meet it. I am going to do this badly at first, he said. There will be moments where the walls go up before I catch them. There will be times when I choose the wrong thing to prioritize. I am, he paused, honest in the way that clearly cost him something, not accustomed to being chosen.
Not like that.
Not the way you chose me. Amy looked at him steadily. But I am choosing this, he said.
You.
Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I'm choosing it clearly and completely, and I am not a beat going to be avoidant about it anymore. A moment of absolute quiet. Column 3, Amy said softly. Entry 48. Delete it. I'll think about it.
Amy.
Brian. She leaned forward across the kitchen island, close enough that the rest of the world felt considerably farther away. I chose you before I could finish the thought. You're not going to do this badly. You're going to do it yours, which is different and harder in some ways, but I have been watching you do impossible things with precision for 3 years, and I am not even slightly worried. He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached across the island and tucked one loose braid back behind her ear, an impossibly gentle gesture from a man who ran an empire on severity, and left his hand there, warm against her jaw.
The column, he said.
Entry 48. What does it say? She looked at him. We'll not say it first, but we'll show it in every possible other way until it's unavoidable. He held her gaze. I love you, he said. First. Clearly. Like a man who has made a decision and is not going back. Amy Louise, who had stepped in front of a blade for him, who had survived 5 days of hospital crackers, who had organized his entire empire from a spreadsheet with 17 columns, went completely quiet. Then, I have loved you, she said, since approximately month 4. I have a timestamp. He almost laughed. Almost. It was very close. Of course you do, he said. She was smiling again. He was looking at her like she was the only irreplaceable thing in his world. Marcus, who had arrived at the penthouse for his 6 o'clock check-in and was standing in the hallway outside the kitchen, heard enough to form a complete picture, silently celebrated, and texted Daniel Wu. It happened. Daniel Wu texted back, finally. Marcus put his phone away, turned around, and went back downstairs. Some things did not require a debrief. 3 months later, Brian Coley sat at his desk in the penthouse study, a room that now had a sticky note on the door that said, "Not a war room. Eat first," and signed the last document on the restructured Victor Seng corridor agreement. He set his pen down. Amy appeared in the doorway, not because she had been summoned, but because she always knew, in the specific way that 3 years of proximity builds in a person, when something was finished. Done, she said. Done, he said. She crossed the room, settled on the arm of the chair beside him, and looked at the signed pages with the quiet satisfaction of someone who appreciates completed things. Column 11, she said. Entry 22. Moments when the empire runs exactly as it should. He looked at her. Entry 23, she said, softer. Same column. He reached for her hand. She gave it. Outside the study window, the city went on. Vast, complicated, full of danger and beauty and the ordinary miracle of ordinary life. Inside, it was very quiet, very warm, exactly as it should be. And that, my loves, is where we leave Brian and Amy, chosen, complete, and finally home. If this story moved something in you, if you felt every moment of it, then you are exactly who this channel was made for. Welcome to the family. Drop a comment below and tell me which chapter had you holding your breath. I read every single one. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Tap that notification bell and share this story with someone who deserves a great love story today. Until next time, take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.